Welcome to part 2 of this first Gen Sequoia rear axle seal and bearing replacement video. In this part, you're going to watch us get all the new parts pressed onto the axle. We're going to get the axle reinstalled onto the vehicle. We're going to get the parking brake all put back together. And finally, we're going to get the disc brakes all put back together, the wheel on, and then we'll be done with the job. So Buddy got a little excited there and forgot that we're filming this thing, and we didn't actually show the action of getting the axle seal out, but you can see we have my OTC puller set up like this with two jaws that are facing outward. And then you slide this into the seal inside the housing, and then you tighten this up to expand the arms out. And then once you get the seal captured really well, then you just simply slide hammer back and pull it out. It's not a hard thing to do. If you don't have something like this, you can get in there with a hook style puller, do it that way. But I like the slide hammer puller technique to get seals out. Now we're gonna drive in the new seal. There's an obvious stop right there, and Buddy from his experience doing the other side said that you drive the seal in completely to that shoulder. And you can see there's some damage, there's some pitting in here from the water intrusion causing rust. We cleaned it up as best we can with a wire wheel and some brake cleaner. I went ahead and put a little bit of grease in there. I like the CV2 red line grease. It's a nice high temperature wheel bearing grease just to help with the mating of the seal with the axle housing. So get it in there as square as possible, and then you grab a seal driver puck that fits the diameter of the seal as best as you can. You don't want it too narrow to where you'll dimple in the seal. You want the force being applied to the outer edge of the seal as much as you possibly can. So choose a puck that fits the seal as best you can. On my OTC kit, this is the puck number 4507-7. When driving in these seals, if it starts to go crooked, don't panic. You don't want to pick up one edge of the puck away from the seal face and then just be hammering with one edge because you'll dimple the seal. So whatever happens, keep the driver puck firmly against the full face of the seal the whole time you're driving it in. That's sounding really solid, so that lets me know that the seal is fully against the shoulder. I'll just give a couple more taps just to be sure. That's sounding nice and solid. And then I'm going to get in here with my headlamp and just check to see that it looks like it's fully seated in there, and it looks good. Now we're going to get the new bearing into the backing plate. This bearing is actually directly from Koyo. Buddy figured out a way to save a lot of money. The bearing straight from Toyota is like $400. Yep. If you walk right up to the, or is it online or is it at
parts counter? It was $400.
Yeah, if you walk right up to a Toyota parts counter, it's going to cost you $400. He was able to source this bearing directly from Koyo and saved a couple $100. We'll have this part number in the video description, but that's a pretty significant savings. Based off of the bolt pattern, this can only go in one way. So we're going to slide it in there. I'm going to put it up on the block, and then we have to get our studs back in here now. And you get the idea. I'm going to get all the studs back in, and then we'll show you the tightening of them. So now we're going to draw the studs into the bearing housing. On these longer studs, I'm concerned that I might run out of actual thread. So I got a couple washers taking up a little bit of space, so it's not a situation where the nut is going to actually hit an area of the stud near the knurls without any threads. These two have to go through this thing first, so there's no chance that we're going to run out of threads on these. All right, the studs are all sucked up into the bearing housing. Now I'm going to take the nuts back off. And it looks like I didn't have to worry about the washers. There's still threads all the way down to the face of the bearing, so I didn't really need to put the washers in there. So now I'm gonna prep the axle with some of the same bearing grease, because I believe that you don't want to assemble parts totally dry, because there's going to be less likely that damage is going to occur to the parts as you're pressing them together. So I'm going to liberally put on a bunch of bearing grease on the axle here, and then I'm also going to put it on the inside of the bearing races so the parts just slide together nice and smoothly. Okay, the axle is lubricated well, and then I'm going to put some on the inside of the inner races on both of them. This race right here, this was the one that was stuck onto the axle, and then the other one came loose. That's generally what happens, is the outer one stays connected, the inner one breaks free. Okay, those are nice and lubricated. And then this assembly goes down on the axle like this, because remember, your brake parts need to face the axle flange. So you don't go on like this, you go on like this. Next, we're going to take the special washer. The concave side faces the bearing and the convex side faces up. Now we want to grab the correct retainer. There's two different sizes. The bigger one goes against the bearing. This one goes on after, right up against the ABS tone ring, and this one is the one that interfaces with the inner axle seal to create a leak-free axle, so gear oil doesn't get past and contaminate the bearing. I'm going to liberally apply grease to this thing too, and the bevel faces up. The non-beveled side faces the washer and the bearing. Just like that. Okay, here's what we got. We've got Duane's main tool captured by a couple of press plates on the cross member, and we got it pretty low. And then we've got this adapter right here, and it's two sleeves pressed together. This is just an alignment sleeve to where when you slide on the actual sleeve that is going to be pressing up against this washer, it can't walk off the tool. So this smaller sleeve is just to keep it in there. So then we have the washer, we put that on top. Now we have to carry the axle over and slide it in place. Okay. So now that we have the axle slid in, we're gonna, as a team, grab either side of the cross member and lift it up. We have to get Duane's round plate and put that on top next. It's this sucker right here. So now what I want to do is like get everything as aligned as possible. The washer with the retainer and the washer in relation to this press sleeve. I just want to get it fairly close to where when we start pressing, things don't have to like shift into alignment. I want to get the alignment fairly good right from the outset. And because I own my own set of Duane's tools, I have another one of these. And then I also have this 4" by 4" ½ plate. So this brings the pressing appendage really close to the material we need to press. That's looking good. I'm going to bring the press down to meet up with the plates. I got to lock this off. Do one last alignment check to make sure it's aligned pretty centered. Okay, I'm going to bring it down. All right, it's up against the plates that's loaded up partially. Now, before you get going, just do another sanity check. You're making sure that you're pressing the bearing and backing plate assembly in the correct direction. You made sure that you put that washer between the outer retainer and the bearing. We did that. We have the retainer in the proper orientation with the bevel facing up, and I think we're good to go. This is a situation where we're going to press until we feel the press load up. This part right here of the axle is going to come right to about here on the bearing, and then you'll feel the press load up and you know you're done. Okay, here we go. Ooh, that's getting loading up. Ooh, it loaded up for some reason. It's going now. Okay, the press completely stopped. It's loading up. It should be fully seated. So now what we're going to do is we're going to lower the cross member down so we can remove the axle from the press. Okay, we're going to take this back over to the bench. Another clear indicator that we got it pressed on all the way is we could see the snap ring groove above this outer retainer the whole way around. So it looks good. We have a new snap ring. We're going to slide it over the axle, and then I'm going to use this other set of snap ring pliers, and I'm going to just expand it just enough to where I could slide the snap ring in place. I'm going to be pushing on the back side of the snap ring while I'm opening it up on the front with the tool. To get the snap ring into the groove, you could keep expanding with your pliers and pushing on the backside and snapping in place. But what I prefer to do is I have this kit of press sleeves. I'll put a link in the video description to it. And I got one that fits over the axle and will mate up with the snap ring. And then I just kind of slide hammer it in place. This helps protect the integrity of the snap ring. The more you expand it, the less tight it's going to be on the axle. So I try to get it down pretty far, but then slide hammering it into position with a sleeve like this is my preferred way. But here's the kit that I'm talking about, this big thing of press sleeves. We've used this kit in a lot of different videos. It's come in pretty handy for doing bushing work, whatever. It's really handy. So the last step is we have to press on the ABS tone ring and the inner retainer. If we were smart, we would have taken a measurement from the bearing to the top of the retainer to have some type of reference point, but I forgot. When I've done this on 3rd generation 4Runners and on a 5th gen 4Runner, there's less guesswork because with the 3rd generation 4Runner and 1st generation Tacoma axles, you can accurately use the amount of polished axle showing above the retainer as a good reference point to start from. And then with the 5th gen axles, there's no way you can get it wrong. You just have one retainer, you press it on all the way and you get the snap ring in place. So what we're gonna have to do, because we didn't take a measurement, is we're gonna have to go on fairly carefully. And I do remember seeing just a little bit of polished axle showing above the retainer. I looked at previous footage and the polished portion kind of angles up right here. So what I'm going to do is just press it on to where I can barely see a little bit of the polished axle showing. And I remember looking at this setup, I could look underneath the ABS tone ring and be able to visualize the snap ring. So that's another good reference point. It's going to potentially be a situation where we're going to do some press work. We're going to have to take the axle off the press, go back to the vehicle, insert the axle, put some Sharpie marks on here, and then see where the seal is riding on the retainer to see if we have a good mating. If it needs a little bit of adjustment, then we'll go back to the press. So we're going to err on not driving it in far enough and see where we're at. If we drive it in too far, then we might get into a situation where we have to pull it back. And if we drive it in way too far, then we might not even be able to get this tool underneath the ABS tone ring to pull it up to the right position. So we're going to be really careful and go incrementally. And then when we discover what the proper height of this assembly is down to the bearing, then we'll take a measurement for you. So I'm going to grease this up and get these parts in place. We have all the parts greased up. We have the axle greased up. We have the ABS tone ring greased up. And then the inner retainer. The inner retainer, it doesn't matter the orientation because both sides are beveled. But the ABS tone ring has a proper orientation. It goes down like this. You wouldn't want it like this with the open side facing up. And then what I did is, because looking at the video footage, we could see a little bit of polished axle showing, I marked with a paint pen where that high part is, where we can see a little bit of polished axle. That's going to be our indicator, a reference point when we're pressing. Another reference point is as the ABS tone ring gets close to the outer retainer in the snap ring, that's going to be another thing I'm going to be looking at, because I remember I can look down here and see the snap ring. So the ABS tone ring wasn't hiding it all the way. Okay, so we're going to get this over to the press. Again, we have the press sleeve and then that washer. Same setup. So Buddy's going to drop the axle in. Now together, we're going to lift the assembly up with the cross member. So now we're going to get everything centered and then start pressing the parts on. Okay, we've got it all set up. The main mistake that we can make in this journey is going too far. So we're going to press it on a certain amount and then stop short, most likely a little short, and then bring it over to the vehicle, insert the axle, and see where we're at. I just don't want to go too far, because then it's going to be a pain in the ass. We have to knock the studs out, get the special tool in here so we can pull it back a little bit. So I'm going to err on the side of not pushing the parts on enough. I'm going to stop right there. We're going to release the press, and I'm going to pull this up and see if we can see any polished axles showing above the retainer right now, just to give me an idea where we're at. So what Buddy and I did as a team is we kept on pressing on the inner retainer and ABS tone ring in small increments, like 1 millimeter or 2 millimeters at a time. Then we would come back here, we'd insert the axle, and what we found on our initial adjustments is that the inner retainer was hitting the inside of the axle housing, and we weren't able to fully seat it up against the axle housing flange. So then we'd pull it out, drive it in 1 millimeter or 2 more, come back, and so now this is like our third or fourth attempt.
Third.
And we were able to get the axle fully seated. We got the 17 millimeter nuts tight, and we're seeing if we can turn the axle.
Axle turns freely.
The axle's turning freely, and before it wasn't doing that. And what we did is we made some Sharpie marks on the inner retainer, so when we pull this axle out, we'll be able to see where the seal is currently riding on the inner retainer. Now he's going to pull the axle back out, and we'll take a look. So after all the pain and suffering Buddy and I went through to make sure we didn't press the ABS tone ring and inner retainer on too far, paid off. You can see the line right here where the seal is riding, and that looks to be pretty damn close to dead center on the retainer. With the axle fully bolted up, the axle turns freely. This inner retainer isn't grinding inside the axle housing, so we're comfortable where this is at, and we're good. Now let's take a measurement with some calipers and see if we can give you a good reference point so you don't have to go through the pain and suffering that we did to get it to the proper depth. So I have a digital caliper. I zeroed it out. I'm going to open this up, and I'm going to measure down to the bearing here, not to the metal washer in between the outer retainer and the bearing, but actually to the bearing dust seal. Unfortunately, I can't measure to the top of the inner retainer because my digital caliper is not going to hit that, but it will hit the ABS tone ring. So let's see if we can give you some type of measurement. So that's like 38.5 millimeters. Let me do that again. Yeah, about 38.6, 38.5, somewhere in that area. And then let's see if I could just kind of eyeball it and see where this would be from the bearing to the top of the retainer. That looks like about right, 56.5 millimeters. So that's a good reference point for you Or you can do it just like we did, where you err on the side of caution, and what you use as a benchmark, when you look down below the ABS tone ring, you should be able to see the snap ring and not much more. Maybe like a millimeter of the axle I can see. But I think this distance between the ABS tone ring and the top of the outer retainer, it looks to be pretty small. Let me see if I could take a measurement with this. And if anything, it's about 3 millimeters. We think this distance between the top of the retainer and the beginning of the ABS tone ring is somewhere between 2.5 and 3 millimeters. But just learn from our experience. Take some type of measurement so when you're pressing on the new parts on the axle, you got a good idea. These axles aren't as easy as a 3rd generation 4Runner or a 1st gen Tacoma, because with the 1st generation Tacomas and 3rd generation 4Runner axles, you could fairly accurately rely on the amount of polished axle showing above the inner retainer. It's pretty damn good. It's not perfect, but it's pretty accurate. And with those axles, we determine it's like somewhere between 3 to 5 millimeters of polished axle showing above the inner retainer. And it ends up turning out pretty damn good most of the time. But the gold standard is verifying you have a good mating of the inner retainer with the axle seal by inserting the axle, tightening up the nuts fully, spinning the axle, taking it out, and then seeing where the seal is riding on the inner retainer. And that is the gold standard to let you know you have a good mating of the seal with the inner retainer. And it certainly seems to me that there is not a lot of room for error. If you don't press the inner retainer and ABS tone ring on far enough, this inner retainer is going to grind against the inside of the axle housing. So it's a very tight tolerance. Basically what we did is, as soon as we got the inner retainer and ABS tone ring driven on far enough to where there was no interference with the axle housing, we found that the seal was riding perfectly. So it's a very, very close tolerance. You obviously could drive it on a lot further, but then if you do that, then you're going to put yourself in a situation where if you ever have to do this job again, you're not going to be able to get Duane's special tool underneath the ABS tone ring to draw it off.
And you get a leak.
Yeah, and you get a leak. So what I'm trying to say is you want to drive it on far enough, but not too far to where you can no longer get the tool in there and you get a bad mating of the seal with the inner retainer. God, I hope that makes sense. But at least we were able to give you some reference measurements, so you'll hopefully have an easier time getting the proper depth of the ABS tone ring and inner retainer on the axle. We had to do quite a bit of back and forth on the press, but we finally got it. I'm putting a little bit of bearing grease on this inner retainer, and this is just so the initial turning of the axle inside the seal, it's not going to cause it any damage, because it's going to take just a little bit for the gear oil to get in there and start lubricating the seal. So I'm just going to put a little bit of grease on here as some extra insurance to not prematurely wear out the seal. We have to remember to get this O-ring onto the end of the axle housing. This is a weather barrier. This helps keep water out of the bearing. So you just slip this over here and fit it on. I like to do one extra step and put a little grease on the O-ring. It's personal preference. I don't know if you have to do that, but I just figure maybe the O-ring being a little bit lubricated is gonna make a better seal with the axle. Okay, now I'm gonna let Buddy insert the axle. When you're going in with the axle, you wanna do what Buddy's doing. He's supporting the axle shaft with his left hand while guiding it in. You don't wanna be leaning a lot of weight of the axle shaft onto the seal. You wanna protect that seal. There it is. Okay, he's gonna get the nuts on there and cinch them up. I never looked up the torque specs for a Sequoia, but I'm just using some specs that I got from the 5th gen 4Runner job we did, and that spec was 44 foot-pounds, so that's what we're going to use for these nuts. Okay, you get the idea. He's going to do the other 3. Now that we got the axle back in, we're going to work on getting the brake parts back in here. There's areas where you want to grease for the shoes so they move more freely. 3 on each side. And then you also want to grease right up here on either side of this pin where the shoe comes in contact. So I'm just going to grease all these spots right now. All right, those are all greased up. Since this parking brake cable came off a little rough, I'm just cleaning it up with a brass brush. So hopefully it'll be easier to get out in the future if he ever has to do it. Okay, that's good enough for government work. I have to slide this cable back through. Okay, that's slid in nice, and I gotta grab my 2 10mm bolts and cinch those up. So I cinched up those little 10mm bolts with a 1/4 inch ratchet, just went by feel, no torque spec. Now I'm gonna take the rear shoe and I'm gonna reconnect the cable to the parking brake lever. There we go. Just like that. We're gonna reverse our procedure and get the parts back connected. So one of the last things we did is we disconnected the brake shoe hold down spring. So I'm gonna pre-assemble that curved pin with the spring parts onto the backing plate first. So I'm gonna insert the curved pin into the back hole, and then I remember that the curve of the pin faces the axle. It doesn't face this way or up or down. You wanna get it in about that orientation. Then we slide this plate on with the hook facing the backing plate. Then we put the spring on. And then finally we have to get the outer plate in position. So you have to slide it over and then rotate it 90 degrees to lock it in place. Okay, so it's locked in place. What I'm gonna do is get in here with my special tool and hold this compressed while I rotate the shoe into position. We show this in another video, but we'll show it again here. So this is the special tool I'm talking about. I'm gonna get it behind the whole assembly, and I'm gonna lever up against this top piece right here to hold it compressed. So then I'll get the shoe up into position. Gotta get in here with my headlamp and see what I'm doing. It looks like I have the pin into the slot. When I pull this tool away, it wants to bring the spring assembly with it. So I'm gonna hook it and hold it. And I got it in there. So then now what I have to do is I have to get the little hook of the clip into this hole. Just like that. I fit this spring back. I should have did it ahead of time, but it's not really that hard to get hooked in. So again, remember, it hooks into a hook right there. So you literally just like fit it in there and hook it just like that. Not a big deal. So I'm gonna let that hang there. Remember the proper orientation of this piece. The adjuster side faces the front. The side that pulls out faces the rear. I'm gonna put a little bit more grease on here. If we had more time, I would have cleaned everything up really nicely, but we don't have that much time. I'm also gonna put a little bit of grease in these forks, just so there's less noise when you're operating the parking brake. So this adjuster goes in like this on the front shoe, and then it goes into a similar spot on the rear shoe. But before I get this in position, I wanna get the hold down spring assembly ready for the front shoe. So again, I gotta come in with the pin from the back side, and then I gotta come in with this plate with the hook facing the backing plate, the spring, and then the outer plate. Okay, that's locked in. So next I'm gonna get this piece in. Again, I'm gonna lubricate this a little bit with some grease and lubricate this with some grease. I'm gonna take the spring off, put a little grease in there. And I'm gonna set this up on top of the axle. I'm gonna fit it in to the slot on the rear shoe. Okay, that's in position. And then now I'm gonna get the star adjuster in position on the rear shoe. I'm gonna hold it there while pulling on the spring and getting the star adjuster hooked into the front shoe. Just like that. I'm just gonna hold it there for a second. I'm gonna take a look and make sure everything's looking good down here. Okay, that's looking okay. And just remember when you're getting this in, the return spring for the bottom goes behind the star adjuster. It doesn't go in front. So now I'm gonna take my special tool. I'm gonna get it behind the spring assembly. I'm gonna compress it. That worked. I got the pin in the right position. I hooked it with my pick tool to hold it. I have to look on top here and make sure that this piece gets lined up properly. Okay, that's looking pretty good. I got to get the inner plate of the hold down spring assembly slid into the hole here. Okay, that's in there. Okay, that looks pretty good. Everything's properly aligned. The hold down springs are in position. Now I got to get the return springs in. What I have here is a carpenter's clamp, and I tighten the shoes together to where everything is fully compressed. They're in the most retracted position right now. This is going to help me get the return springs in place. So again, I'm just going to take another quick look, see how everything's looking. Everything's looking good. Nothing became displaced. This rear return spring was the last one to come off, so it's going to be the first one to go on. I'm going to get it hooked in the spot that I showed you before. And then my trick is I use a screwdriver to help me. I get it over the pin, and then I lever the screwdriver and I slide the spring in place. I want to collapse this spring just a little bit more. I like that better. And then I got to get the front spring in, which is yellow. Hook it in there first. Same technique with the screwdriver. We'll take my clamp off. Do a last double check of all the parts. So my return springs are in position. The upper part that goes in between the two shoes, that's in position with the spring on the front side. Hold down spring on this front shoe looks good. Hold down spring on this one looks good. And then down below looks good. I think we're all back together. So for the rear shoe spring hold down assembly, we noticed that the outer spring plate was rubbing up against the backside of the axle, and we're trying to figure out why that is. So we took it back apart, and this is an aftermarket pin. This is the original one, but it's tweaked. You can see how it's been bent all out of shape, and I think that's the problem. We're going to use this replacement aftermarket one in this one's place. So we got that new pin in place on the back shoe, got it all back together. Now we got to get the rotor slid back on. One thing I didn't mention is I should have just covered these brake shoes with a little bit of painter's tape to keep my dirty hands from transferring grease to them, but I just took some brake cleaner and a rag and cleaned them off as best as I could. We installed the rotor, and we had a little bit of difficulty because there was a little edge right here that was damaged and it was creating a lip, so we had to file it down, and then now we were able to slide it on. The proper adjustment for the parking brake is you get the hole in the rotor and the axle lined up with the star adjuster, and then you turn it down to where it locks it in place. No movement. Then you come in with your screwdriver and you back it off about 3 clicks, and that should be pretty close. See if it turns. Okay, it turns now. Will the rotor come off? It still will come off, but that's pretty darn close to being adjusted. I'm gonna leave it just like that. So again, tighten it all the way up and then back off this star adjuster like 3 clicks or 3 pushes with the screwdriver, and that's about right. You'll have a pretty good feel with your parking brake when you apply it. Next, I want to draw the rotor firmly against the axle face so we can have an easier time getting the brake pads into position and the caliper over it. There's just not enough threads extending past the face of the rotor, so I'm going to put a washer on 2 of them and then use a couple lug nuts and suck the rotor right up against the face of the axle. Okay, that's pretty good. And then now we're going to get the brake bracket with the pads in place. And then I got to get my bolts started. Okay, both of those are started. The torque spec for those 2 17mm bolts that hold the brake bracket to the brake dust shield assembly is 74 foot-pounds. Okay, they're both torqued to 74 foot-pounds. So now we're going to get the brake caliper slid over the pads. And then as we're sliding this in position, you got to compress these rubber pieces that the pins slide through so you don't mess them up. Now we got to get the pins in. I'm going to put a little bit of grease on these. So now I'm going to slide the pins in and get them started. Okay, I got both started. The torque value for these caliper bolts is 66 foot-pounds. Okay, they're both torqued to 66 foot-pounds. I've got the brake line back into the bracket on the brake backing plate, and I'm going to slide it into position. The appendage faces outward and the flat side goes towards the bracket. Just get it in there, tap it part of the way in place here, and then I'll finish driving it all the way home with a little pry bar. There it is. Now we got to get this sucker off of here and get the brake line reconnected. This might be fun because this thing doesn't turn worth a shit because it's bent.
Got it right?
Yeah, got it.
Nice. Good job.
I cinched up the brake line with an open end 10mm. Now I'm gonna do the final tightening with a flare nut. Okay, that's tight. I'm gonna get the ABS sensor reconnected. I like putting a little bit of grease on the O-ring so it just makes it easier to remove it in the future. And then you slide it back in where it went. Go to your home.
Go home.
And then just get the little 10mm bolt in there. I'm not gonna torque this to spec. I'm just gonna use that German spec we all know and love, good and tight. We bled the brakes, but I didn't bother showing you because we have a video on how to bleed brakes. If you want to watch that, click on the link above and you can watch that, but it's not hard. There's probably 5 million videos out there on YouTube on how to properly bleed brakes. So we're going to get the wheel reconnected, lug nuts snugged up. We're going to lower it to the ground, and then we're going to torque the lug nuts to 85 foot-pounds. We should be done other than Buddy taking it for a test drive and making sure nothing crazy happens, like the wheels fall off or the whole rear axle comes out from underneath them. Who knows?
Could happen.
But we double checked all our work. We're fairly confident everything is on back properly. We did the axle job correctly, so
Fingers crossed.
fingers crossed everything is fine on his test drive. So I'm gonna start cleaning up tools and he's gonna get his tire on. All right, we are all done with this job. The one big mistake that we made is we didn't take a measurement and really get a good determination of how far onto the axle the inner retainer and ABS tone ring are pressed on. In the past, I've been able to rely on things like how much polished axle is showing above the retainer, like it is on 3rd generation 4Runners and 1st gen Tacomas. And then with the 5th gen 4Runner, there's no guesswork at all because it only has one retainer and you press it on all the way to where you can get the C-clip in place and then you're good to go. But with this one, we messed up and didn't really take a good note of how far to press on the ABS tone ring and the inner retainer. So it took a lot of pressing a little bit, taking the axle out, putting in the axle into the axle housing, checking to see if we needed to press on the retainer and ABS tone ring further. So it took us about 3 or 4 times and we finally got it. So it worked out. And then we were able to give you some measurements that you can use as a guideline to be able to have a little bit easier of a time doing the press work without doing what we did, having to pull the axle off of the press multiple times and recheck it at the vehicle by inserting it into the axle housing. The parking brake, even though I have a lot of experience with it now, still gave us some hiccups because one of the pins was bent, and when we were turning the axle, we noticed that the plate on the outside of the brake hold down spring assembly, it was rubbing up against the backside of the axle, which isn't ideal. And so we had to then disassemble the brakes, get a new pin in there, kind of a pain in the butt, but we had to do it because we did see that the outer plate of that spring assembly had evidence that it was grinding up against the axle. I could see it. So we had to do something about that. I hope this video helped you out. If you have any questions or comments, do that below. We thank you for watching Toyota Time with Timmy the Toolman and Sean and special guest Buddy. Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing. If you haven't subscribed yet, I don't know what you're waiting for. It doesn't cost you anything. Click on that subscribe button and also click on that notification bell if you'd like to be notified when we put up new content on our channel. Peace out. Happy wrenching, sick mods, and sick rear wheel bearing and seal replacements on your first gen Sequoia. Bye-bye.